Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to welcome our Heath Lecture Series speaker today, Yale professor Dr. Paul Bracken, to Stevens for what I expect will be a fascinating conversation about technology and strategy. Paul will talk about disruptive innovation and the Pentagon and how the digital revolution has transformed one business after another, including how the Pentagon thinks about strategic matters like defense and security. Professor Bracken is a leading expert in global competition and the strategic application of technology in business and defense. He's a consultant to private equity funds, accounting and insurance companies, as well as the US government. Bracken is consistently rated as one of the top executive education teachers in the world, merging practical and academic perspectives. Bracken leads the new Yale MBA core course on problem framing, which has received global recognition, and his Managing Global Organizations course, a signature Yale class, draws nearly 300 students. I definitely want to know more about these courses, Paul. Professor Bracken leads business war games for companies facing complex new problems. He has led games on the future of European asset management and strategies of technological competition with China. Ladies and gentlemen, I am thrilled to invite one of the top-rated executive education teachers in the world, Yale professor Dr. Paul Bracken, to the podium.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. Every dean that I know and every departmental chair loves this course with 300 students. They want to put 600 in there because they love that sense of efficiency. Anyway, I am really especially delighted to be here at Stevens today. I grew up in Philadelphia, not far from here. And when I was in high school, I almost applied to Stevens, but I didn't, so I didn't go here. But I was always curious. My first trip to the campus is today. I've never set foot on the campus. And I knew it had a spectacular vista of New York, but I didn't realize quite how spectacular it was. And I looked at the dormitories there, and just to think that some kids there look out and see this Manhattan skyline is just really wonderfully impressive. So I'm really delighted to be here today, and I'd like to thank Ed Friedman for setting this up. He's a dear friend who I've known for a couple years now, and he has really been instrumental in setting up this whole talk today. What I would like to talk about is exactly the subject that's up there, Silicon Valley and the Pentagon. And my basic argument is pretty simple, which is that nobody in here, I don't think, would disagree with the statement that IT has transformed one industry after another, from telecommunications to healthcare. If anything, education is probably a laggard, but it is being changed now with MOOCs and all kinds of additions of IT to the classroom. My subject is really how the IT is transforming, disrupting, if you will, the Department of Defense. And my thesis is that it is dramatically changing the Pentagon. And my job is to describe today to you, to a lot of people who probably don't have a lot of background in the military or national security issues, what some of the factors are, what are the things going on of a positive and negative character. Whenever I teach at Yale, I always like to put up a takeaway list of the big points that are worth remembering. I'm not going to talk to the slides, but let me sort of just summarize a few things here. We have more technologies coming online today in the military. We haven't seen anything like this since the 1950s. So it's not just that cyber warfare is like a really big deal and drones are like a really big deal. It's you have all of the technologies listed in number 2 with enormous national security implications, from driving up the cost of the defense budget to bad guys getting them. We'll go into some of this today. But they're all coming along at the same time. In addition, there's a nuclear weapons context developing, as you may have noticed. Anybody who isn't brain dead has heard about the Iranian negotiations. Think of it this way. These new technologies are coming along at the same time that a nuclear context has taken hold in the Middle East, in South Asia, and in East Asia. We know about the Iranian negotiations. What you probably may not know about is that Israel not only is a nuclear weapon state, but Israel has just recently purchased 6 diesel submarines from Germany that are now, 5 of them are sailing out of Haifa, which is the Israeli submarine port. And these are almost surely nuclear weapon carriers, carrying nuclear warhead cruise missiles. And they're not doing this submarine venture to sink the Palestinian Navy, let's put it that way. They're shifting their nuclear forces offshore. Well, similar things are happening. Xi Jinping was just in China, or just in Pakistan yesterday, the day before, and he's selling 8 submarines to the Pakistani Navy, almost surely designed to carry nuclear warheads. India already has these things. Okay. This is causing and has caused a fundamental change in the U.S. defense industry. All right. And I'm going to draw back, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the Cold War, one of which is my point number 5 in there. If you go back to the Cold War, what is the real response when a company or a country is inundated with a bunch of new technologies all at the same time? Okay? I think the most standard reaction is when we'd like to say, well, it's going to change our strategy, this, that, and the other thing. What happened in the 1950s is that people looked at these technologies and they had no idea what they meant or how to use them. There was intellectual vacuums inside the United States government, inside the Pentagon in the 1950s about how to handle all these technologies. You would too. It's a really hard problem. So technology today, like the 1950s, is racing ahead of strategy. Okay? We don't know where this stuff is going. The Air Force pretty much understands drones. The Navy understands submarines. Nobody puts these individual elements together into a national strategy. That's not a criticism. I'm sympathetic to people in the government because it's a really hard problem. Let me begin and sort of jump from the cosmic down to the mundane. If you drive around New Jersey, you'll see something on top of police cars. I was driving to the mall in Connecticut at Christmas time. I was stuck in traffic. There was an accident. There was a police car there. He had these things on top of it. And I'm sort of a radio buff. I know when you have radios. But I've never seen what these things are. These are automatic license plate readers. You put one of these on a car, and these are routinely employed in Connecticut today, and probably New Jersey. You drive down a street or you go through the parking lot at a mall and you just drive around, and these cameras swivel and take pictures of every single license plate. They run them in a real-time database search, and they find criminals, hot cars, people who haven't made their alimony payments, anybody who's on the hot sheet. All right. I want to emphasize here, this is a technology which is not in the future. It's operating in New Jersey today, just as it is in Connecticut. Take this technology and add another technology to it, namely facial recognition technology. This has been deployed at various Super Bowls, in which cameras scan for facial features of, say, known terrorists in their database. And if they get a hit, they can preemptively find and isolate the individual. All right. Now, one of the things that went on back in the 1950s and is going on today comes from these last 2 slides. And that is what happens if you add the technologies together. One of the big themes of my point, and those of you studying technology management or business or liberal arts for that matter, is the importance of combining things and see how they relate. If you take automatic license plate readers and facial recognition technology and you combine it, you get a really good system for targeted killings. Because you take the information from the sensors, from the facial recognition, and the automatic license plate readers, and you uplink it to an intelligence center that's in a van somewhere in Saudi Arabia, or at Fort Meade, Maryland, the home of the National Security Agency, and compare it to what you want, a list of people you want to find. Suppose you wanted to find a nuclear scientist in Tehran. And you wanted to make sure that you actually had the nuclear scientist in your gun sights. You wouldn't rely on any one of these technologies, but if you combine them and fed the data into a Predator drone firing a Hellfire missile, you get this actual, now I can't say this is what caused this. This was an Israeli attack, a targeted, well, probably an Israeli attack, on a nuclear scientist in Tehran, where in this instance they put a magnetic mine on the back of his car from a motor scooter. But the really interesting question is obviously not, that's not the tricky part. The tricky part, how do you know you're getting the right person in the car? Think of what this could do if you escalated it to an attack on 100 people or 1,000 people. In principle, you could decapitate the leadership of a government by targeting where they live at night, driving around in their cars, in one big pulse attack. Now, I'm not saying this is going to work flawlessly. I'm saying it's a very dangerous technology. It is a major thrust of militaries in several countries, including our own. And it illustrates the complementary character of these technologies. So I'd like to teach it this following way. I'd like to go to the 30,000 foot level, big picture stuff, abstract, then go down to like the 5 foot level. I figure a car getting blown up in Tehran is about 4 or 5 feet off the ground, so it's a very practical example. Let's go back up to 30,000 feet. Why should you care about the Pentagon and the Silicon Valley? There's a lot of reasons. The Pentagon has been a huge driver of innovation in the United States. The integrated circuit, the first transistor came out of an Army contract to build an amplifier that could take signals under the Atlantic Ocean. So you wouldn't need vacuum tubes. So it is an enormously important source of venture capital money and innovation. The Department of Defense can and will take risks that a private sector company would never dream of taking. Most private sector companies don't have to take these risks, so they don't. But the Pentagon will. It doesn't matter if there's a low estimate of system success. All right, this is a very important point I want to emphasize too. The technology, which people in here are especially attuned to, defines what strategies you can and can't use. Think of the Cold War in the following terms. The United States goes into World War II. We win World War II. We raise 90 Army divisions and something like 20 Marine divisions. So you have 110 divisions to defeat Adolf Hitler's Nazi Wehrmacht and the Japanese Empire. In the Cold War, the peak size of the US Army is 18 divisions. It's actually closer to 16. Most of them had 1 or 2 brigades. Okay. We had spent 7% of the GDP on defense over the average of the Cold War. If you go back to World War II, we were spending 43% of the GDP on defense. Artificial comparison, because the Cold War was fought over 50 years, World War II over 4 years, but you sort of get the point I want to make. And this led to this investment in technologies in the Cold War, which led to the transistor, the integrated circuit, the internet, jet aircraft, space satellite communication systems, produced a primacy for the United States, both in business and war. The United States fought the Cold War with one hand tied behind its back compared to what it did in World War II. Another reason we should care about this is other countries are building Silicon Valleys of their own. It's not that we're facing countries in the world with primitive technologies anymore. Would that that were true. I mentioned Germany building these diesel submarines and selling them to Israel, giving them away. If the almost surely carry nuclear weapons. You may have heard about the Stuxnet joint venture, which according to the New York Times, was a joint venture between the United States and Israel to develop computer viruses which infected the industrial control systems for the uranium centrifuges in Iran. These things that spin around to separate the uranium-235 from uranium-238. Okay, you may have read a few days ago, Russia's selling an S-300 air defense system to Iran. The level of advanced technology crossing borders is unprecedented. Nothing like this happened in the Cold War. And there's going to be winners and losers in war, business, and society. Would that this stuff were never happening, but it kind of is, so we got to face up to it. Here's just some of the technologies. I'm going to talk about these today and compare them with what was going on in the 1950s. But we take these things for granted today, but guided missiles were revolutionary. The V-2 rockets that Hitler fired on London had no guidance whatsoever. Their guidance system was when the engine ran out of gas, the missile conked out. Hopefully it was on top of London and it fell. And they had an impact fuse. It was a very primitive system. Today, we have these, and I'm going to go into some of the examples of this, but let's get back to my complementary point. ASAT, by the way, is anti-satellite weapons, which are these satellites or lasers on the ground in which you paint satellites in the sky. The United States is completely dependent on communication satellites to talk to its worldwide military forces. When I grew up back in the day, I was something called a ham radio operator, and we had a Morse code key, okay, and we used high frequency radio, which had ionosphere, it would bounce off the ionosphere, and it was a very iffy proposition to get to Hawaii with a signal. Now you can get there very easily with a communication satellite unless it is attacked by someone. And from what we know, both Russia and China are putting enormous investments into anti-satellite programs. Let me get into this sort of technology and the strategy lag. But what do we really mean by this? Well, one of the things you might study in your investment classes is that Warren Buffett has a rule. He will not invest in technology. Why? Because it's too uncertain. People have all these cutting-edge technologies that you hear about. What about all the ones that didn't make it? All right. Nobody is using a Netscape web browser here anymore. They got killed by Internet Explorer. It's too risky, and we don't know how to forecast which technologies are going to be successful, which ones are not. The problem is Warren Buffett can do that and get away with it. It's a prudent strategy as an investor. The United States government and the Pentagon cannot do it. There is this race ahead of technology. What I find interesting is that back in the 1950s, a whole new set of methodologies, which you are studying in various forms in your classes, like game theory, operations research, and systems analysis, were invented to get at this problem of the national strategy and technology. Namely, we can use these methodologies to find out which technologies we should buy. Think of it this way. If you've ever taken a course in logic, there's first order logic where you have elements in a set. Second order logic says, how do you put these things together? So the national strategy part looks at cyber warfare, stealth drones, and says, how much of this should we buy? How much should we not buy? What certain packages are absolutely necessary to have, and what are the other packages which may be upsetting to international order because other countries will see what we're doing and respond in kind. and we're going to have an escalation of the arms race. I maintain to you, and I'm trying to be a little bit flippant here, that back in the 1950s and to some extent the 60s, people put a lot of thought into these frameworks. They were imperfect, they had their flaws, but they were not grossly misleading. We haven't started looking yet. Most of the literature you'll read on these technologies will say, drones can do this, that, and the other thing. We can land a drone into the Kremlin. We can have a cyber attack which will take down Iran. That's not the question. The question for strategy is, what are the systems that you can buy which will actually improve the security of the United States, not just kill or disrupt bad guys? Let me skip over the history of Silicon Valley. There's a very interesting top secret history of Silicon Valley that at least my students at Yale are utterly convinced that Silicon Valley started with this really old guy named Steve Jobs, and then he died of cancer, all right? And he came up with this thing called the Apple computer and the graphical user interface. Let me assure you there's a history of Silicon Valley that goes well back to the 1960s, and it was basically funded by the military, by the National Reconnaissance Office, the National Security Agency, and the spooky parts of the Air Force. This is the Cold War at Stanford. Just to give you an illustration, this is a map of the Soviet Union, and what Stanford did was to move the Cold War battlefield of World War II 500 miles east. At Stanford, they created a lot of satellite companies which later became known as Silicon Valley. Many of those companies were developing electronic warfare systems. And we could make this complicated. Let's make it simple. What their electronic warfare systems did was to jam Russian radars so that US bombers could penetrate into the Russian heartland and destroy the Soviet Union. There's no other way to put it. Okay? And that was one of the original impetuses to the creation of Silicon Valley. Later on, Silicon Valley moves into the much larger market of commercial technology, which is what we are familiar with. I am here to tell you today that the United States has created, not only have we using Silicon Valley back in the way we did in the Cold War in recent technologies, but the United States has created a second Silicon Valley in the Dulles Corridor of Northern Virginia. Next time you're in Northern Virginia, take the Silver Metro line and drive out there. You'll see hundreds, if not thousands, of companies that are doing what Stanford spin-off companies did in the 1960s. Okay. Let's take a look at the impact of this technology change on competition and innovation in the United States. And the point I want to make, and we'll make in a second, is a fundamental one, which is that the locus of innovation, of defense innovation, in a relative sense, has shifted from the large defense contractors to small and medium-sized enterprises. So it used to be at Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Raytheon. Now it has shifted to a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises for good reason. The large defense companies in the United States are characterized by this curve. As competition goes up and is high, nobody has enough money to innovate. You become a commodity supplier. Down here, you have a monopoly. No incentive to innovate because you have a monopoly. All right? There's an ideal middle ground. If you look at the history of the US defense industry over the past 20 years, after the Cold War, it shifts over here in the 1990s, and innovation declines. The 1990s was a period where no basic fundamental new technologies were developed by the big defense contractors. When 9/11 hits, these defense contractors are unable to supply the needs of the Department of Defense and the National Security Agency. So what happens is the big defense contractors turn to, guess what, small and medium-sized enterprises. This is a busy graph, but what it says in essence, if you look at the Pentagon budgets, research, development, test, and evaluation, this is the front end of a new weapon system. The research and development and also the testing and the evaluation. What this chart says is that it wasn't just the big defense contractors who got the RDT&E money after 9/11, it was a lot of smaller companies. When you read about the expose that Edward Snowden showed some 2 years ago, you find all this incredible spying, pulling off the internet. PRISM, there's a program to read people's emails, hacking into cell phones and things like that. That was undertaken by the NSA, the National Security Agency. And how did they do it? Because they have geniuses on the staff? No. Like everybody in the Pentagon, they go outside because they don't have the technology themselves. And they go to Silicon Valley and create a second Silicon Valley in Northern Virginia. And this is what led to the technologies that Mr. Snowden exposed. Let me give another example. This is the F-35 fighter currently coming online, the most sophisticated, expensive air combat or fighter aircraft ever built in history. I don't know what, it's hard to figure out what it costs. But you would look at this thing and you'd say, well, first of all, it's an airplane. It's an F-35, so it must be a fighter, not a bomber. What it actually is a flying network, a fusion engine to pull all of these intelligence networks that Snowden exposed, to pull all the analyzed data in, get it into the cockpit to do something about it. So what you're looking at is a flying computer network, all right, that can take targeting information from CIA, NSA to a degree which is unprecedented by any fighter aircraft in history. Now, I have this interesting chart which I got from the project engineer who ran the F-35 project office for Lockheed. When a combat aircraft comes into any combat aircraft, the prime contractor cannot do all of the work. So they outsource it to other companies for specialized things. So there's companies that make the seats that explode out of the aircraft, for example. That's something that Lockheed doesn't really want to get into. The F-35 is the most outsourced airplane of any in history. This is the F-16. Only 20% of the value of the contracts for the F-16 are sent outside. The F-22, a stealth aircraft, 55%. 70%, 70 cents out of every dollar that comes into Lockheed is outsourced to guess where? These small and medium-sized companies that are building these complex computer networks. So, I mean, at one level, there's a tremendous demand for engineers and scientists and IT specialists who know how to do this thing. What the Pentagon found was that dealing with silicon, why did they outsource it from Lockheed? Because they had to. They didn't have the technologies in-house. Those of you in business school, one of the hottest things going on in business school now is the study of what you keep in-house, what you source from outside, how you make that decision, and what it has to do with the corporate bottom line. Another major consideration is the intellectual property of the technology. Like, can I keep it? Will the small company use this to grow and attack my business base? This is one of the most fascinating areas of technology management. What they found in the DoD was that dealing with Silicon Valley was very good, but we needed somebody closer at hand. So what they did was create this second Silicon Valley in Northern Virginia of thousands of companies who work for the Directorate of National Intelligence, the National Reconnaissance Office, the CIA. These are multi-billion dollar agencies who support the intelligence needs of the Department of Defense. They even built, well, I'm sure for other reasons, the new metro line to connect all of this stuff, the Silver Line in Dulles, out to Dulles. This is a largely invisible or misunderstood system. No one knew that this world existed until two reporters from the Washington Post exposed it about 5 years ago, and Mr. Snowden exposes it in his own way. The Washington Post accounts are quite interesting. They say, look at all of these thousands of companies, waste, fraud, duplication. We are spending so much money on defense, we could save a fortune. To me, this would be like a bureaucrat going out to Silicon Valley and saying, look at all these companies out there. Isn't this wasteful? We have to pool our resources, and every R&D project you have, Silicon Valley company, you have to send up for government review. We will rationalize this system. This would destroy the innovative character of Silicon Valley. But that's not what they did. They built a second one. If you read Secretary of Defense Gates' book in chapter 4, he talks about this openly, and he says it's not going fast enough. The Joint Chiefs just don't get it. We've got to take major steps to increase our rate of innovation of these technologies, get stuff out into the field a lot faster than we have. One of the consequences of Silicon Valley on the Pentagon is the dramatic leadership and management issues this is creating for these agencies. The 10th Fleet is this Navy intelligence body that doesn't have any ships. It handles all the information warfare for the Navy and is co-located at Fort Meade. But the innovation has shifted away from the big companies to lower tiers of the defense companies, of the defense industry, second and third tier suppliers. Related to this, there's a whole world of venture capital and private equity firms created in the last decade around this space. Because this presentation and this way of thinking has been shown to investors and pension funds and university endowments. And their first thought is, tell me what the hot small companies are so I can buy shares in them. All right. Another feature of this is the big defense companies are going around saying, there's so much going on in technology, we can't keep up with it. We're going to give money to a private equity firm, which will search over these small enterprises and tell us which ones have the hot technologies, and we can invest in them or buy them. So one big consequence is you're really changing the structure and the innovation patterns in the defense industry. Another big effect of Silicon Valley is that it ain't just the technologies. It's leading to new kinds of innovation, what I call process innovation. This is a standard book many business schools use, and it makes the point that in innovation, first you get a new product, and that's where the hot payoffs are. But after the new product is installed for a while, it's the processes supporting it that become critical to increasing the performance of the overall system. And let me give an example of that in the defense world. Cruise missiles are these things that fire out of submarines. Usually, sometimes you can fire them off of a destroyer. And we fired 2,000 of these in this time period here. What the Navy did was to look at this system and say, how can we cut down the targeting time? And basically what they did was change the processes so they can cut down the time to fire a cruise missile, get it on a target in Iraq or Afghanistan in something like 1 hour or less. Okay, let me skip through some of this stuff and sort of get to some of the big points and the conclusions. So explicitly, how has the Pentagon been influenced by Silicon Valley? They're leveraging off the private sector innovation cycle. Okay, that's probably the most interesting, important thing. And there's a great example of this 2 years ago. IBM got beat by Amazon Web Services for the CIA's cloud computing contract. The locus of defense has shifted to the small companies. A new Silicon Valley thing has come about. And the defense industry structure is changing in basic ways. Let me just wrap it up with a statement of where I think the gaps are in this. Like in the 1950s, strategy and force planning frameworks that incorporate the new technologies are not being developed. The technologists are racing ahead, and I think that's really important for a school of technology management to be aware of this. Related to that, there's very little thought being given to arms control and non-proliferation. How do you have an arms control agreement around cyber attack or the use of drones or things like that? We are really at the very beginnings of that, okay? And finally, what these technology means for war and peace, for deterrence, for crisis maneuvering. If the United States had to go into a Cuban Missile Crisis with these technologies, with Russia or China, or if Israel and Iran have them, or if Pakistan and India have them, which they do, what is it going to do to the chance that the whole crisis is going to explode, possibly into a nuclear escalation? So I wanted to keep some time for Q&A. I could go into sort of more details on this thing. Let me see if you have any questions about particular technologies that I've listed or some of the dynamics going on between innovation and what's going on in the Department of Defense. Any questions? I don't really know what these frameworks are going to look like at all. When I don't know what something is going to look like, I think wargaming is a very useful way to run some discovery exercises to find out what they might look like. But I don't have any good answers to your question. If I were advising people of hot research areas, this is a really good one to look at. Sure. I would answer this maybe a little bit harshly that I don't find anybody talking about this. The arms control discussions which take place come from an arms control debate of the 1970s where you had two superpowers and it focused on nuclear weapons only. In point of fact, you've got several countries. India, for example, has just started 10 new cyber warfare companies, private equity backed with Indian money. Pakistan is building hundreds of tactical nuclear weapons. And I find almost no discussion of this other than to decry it. We need to raise the level of discussion on these issues dramatically because if you look at the United States we're sort of getting kicked in the teeth over the last few years with Afghanistan and Iraq. To suggest limitations for others that others will agree with, the attitude in Washington is like, we're in an emergency now, the defense budget is going down. How can you come up with possibly banning drones or limiting drones? Only in the smallest possible way do I see some agreements here. Like there's been an agreement for flying areas where you can and cannot fly drones. I'm not saying, I should not say that some of these are probably good, some of them are bad. I'm saying really that we don't know which is which. The fact of the matter is you could look at take the current Iran agreement. We could debate that from the point of view of the strategic actors. Should the US sign it? Should Israel shut up about it? Should Iran sign it? A different framework is from the point of view of the evolution of these systems. Think about this. Israel, France, Britain, Pakistan are now shifting their forces to sea, their nuclear forces to sea. This whole system is responding to nuclear weapons, the whole international systems, to produce what I would call a second nuclear age. The first nuclear age was the Cold War. And people said, we can't allow this to continue. If you look at what I just said, we have allowed it to continue. In some crisis way, it may be better for Israel to have submarines. But the answer to where the world is going, it seems to me, if everybody has submarines which are stable, I don't think that's a good world. You should know that there's academic arguments to the effect that if everyone had nuclear weapons, the world would be a stable place. because everybody would be afraid to use them. In this view, Iran getting nuclear weapons is a good thing, because Israel has nuclear weapons and there'll be a mutual standoff. My response to this argument is that it's something only a tenured professor of social science could possibly believe. And this tenured professor of social science probably teaches at an Ivy League school. If you went into a bar across the street here and said, I just got this great argument, it's really good Pakistan and Iran are getting nuclear weapons, what do you think people would say? All right. Now, I wouldn't rule out that they may be right and there may be induced caution, but there are some major technology stability arguments we're facing. There is a huge gap in the knowledge and understanding the technologies here. My own view is I would not look to government leaders to have the time or the knowledge base or the inclination to tackle these questions. These have to be tackled offline, whether it be in newspaper articles, think tanks, universities, independent scholars doing whatever they do. To go into the NSC and talk about this as I have, is they're overwhelmed with the crisis of the moment. So it's not a good place to debate strategy. In the Cold War, the answer was we developed think tanks for this. Maybe we should do that again. Maybe there's other formats to do that. But I do think we need to raise the awareness, particularly of the synergies of what are going on, the complementarities between different technologies, and the way these things, if they are in fact really destabilizing, that's really imperative for people to think about this. This is a 50-year problem. Question one, would ethics be more prominently featured? I don't know what you think, but I think the answer to that is yes, and that they were in the Cold War, that ethical considerations played a large role. My concern is we're making a Faustian bargain, as we did in the Cold War with nuclear weapons. But ethical considerations about targeted killings, you're already seeing like pushback from that. You're seeing it hurt business sales of some of these technologies because of what's been revealed by Mr. Snowden. And I have not seen ethical discussions of these questions or even nuclear ones in many, many years. So that is really a very fertile area as well. I view these things as, yeah, they're really clearly problems, but they're also major opportunities, particularly for young people, of really interesting stuff to study, stuff that's incredibly relevant to what's going on in the world. And there's a lot of issues. I love issues where if you put in 4 or 5 hours, you can be a world expert on it. And we're talking about that here in many of them. Sure. Okay, what is it particularly about the nuclear? And the answer is many of these technologies complement nuclear weapons. Let me just give an example. The targeted killings. If India wanted to disarm Pakistan, the way to do it is, there's 2 ways to do it. You could do it in a retail way, which is go after every Pakistani missile. Or you could do it in a wholesale way, which is launch a cyber attack on the Pakistani command and control system so that they're blinded and they don't know where their nuclear weapons are, or false information has been introduced into the network while a military attack is taking place. So to put it starkly, to blind them and paralyze them for 2 to 4 hours while your airplanes and missiles come in. This is exactly what people are thinking about, but will not talk very much about in many of these countries. Using a cyber weapon as a preemptive first strike to come in then with possibly nuclear strikes, which you would only do in extreme and emergency. But the mere fact that this is a potential is going to freak out Pakistan, that if they think they're vulnerable in this regard. They're going to take countermeasures. And what would a countermeasure be? Can anybody think of any? If you thought there was going to be a cyber attack, which would blind the people who gave the order to launch nuclear weapons? Well, one answer is to pre-delegate launch authority to the junior military officers. And to say, if you don't hear from us in 2 hours, launch. As distinct from, don't do anything until we tell you to launch. And there's elaborate strategies for pre-delegation to launch nuclear weapons that were worked out in the Cold War that are now being reconsidered in Pakistan and India. Okay.
So that one's really scary because it could be that the attack against Pakistan might not come from India, it might be from a third party. But
Well, it might be from a third party, and I mentioned minimal restrictions. The U.S. has written, according to the New York Times, the U.S. has agreements with Pakistan about where we can fly our drones over Pakistan. Now, what do you think Pakistan's worried about? That we're going to give targeting information to India. Is that implausible, does anybody think? If you go read my book, The Second Nuclear Age, there's a detailed case study in there that in 1972, when Henry Kissinger, President's assistant for national security affairs, President Nixon, went to China with President Nixon, he took with him top secret photographs from the CIA giving the locations and the characteristics of Russian weapons on the Chinese border, Russian nuclear weapons. We transferred the most sensitive targeting information we had to China at the height of the Cold War. So we did it. Whether we're doing it today, I certainly wouldn't know, but Pakistan sure thinks we're likely to do it.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Okay, thank you.
Fascinating.
All right. Okay.
Thank you so much for coming.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's great to be here.